Galera, esse daqui é um outro vídeo que apareceu para mim, que eu achei super interessante, que eu achei que seria legal da gente ver aqui junto, para a gente debater do que ele está falando, tá? O que é esse vídeo? Como vocês podem ler pelo título desse vídeo,
World of Warcraft has seen
ele é o título. Adagente Kotapei Tapk Ribikmik World of Warcraft, tá? Do canal Micro War. Brincadeiras à parte, é o seguinte, esse aqui é um vídeo russo, tá? Feito por um canal russo de World of Warcraft, Micro War. Eu nunca tinha ouvido falar desse canal. E ele fez um vídeo, basicamente, falando sobre expansões que foram canceladas para World of Warcraft. De que a Blizzard ela chegou a trabalhar durante os anos em vários conceitos de expansões que acabaram sendo canceladas, né? E é um assunto que a gente não debate muito, só que eu acho um assunto muito interessante, até para a gente imaginar o que a gente pode ver de expansões mais para frente, tá? Então vamos dar uma olhada nesse vídeo. Mas Codex, o vídeo tá em russo, é um canal russo. Na verdade não, hoje o YouTube ele já tem uma ferramenta em que ele faz a dublagem por inteligência artificial de alguns vídeos para algumas línguas, tá? Então esse aqui, especificamente, ele consegue fazer a dublagem com inteligência artificial para alemão, espanhol, francês, inglês e russo, beleza? Então, eu vou deixar ele aqui em russo, desculpa, em russo, eu vou deixar ele aqui em inglês, até para eu entender, mas ali embaixo vai estar aquela legendazinha em português para a gente dar uma olhada, tá? Eu comecei a ver o vídeo, mas só que eu achei ele tão interessante que eu achei legal trazer aqui para vocês, para a gente fazer esse react. Vamos lá, galera. E galera, antes de continuar, falar rapidamente com vocês sobre um parceiro aqui do canal, que é o ExitLag. O ExitLag é o melhor programa de redução de latência que trabalha para diminuir o MS, o ping dos seus jogos online. E você nunca mais perder aquela partida de PVP ou morrer naquela raid no PvE porque a sua latência estava alta ou porque você estava com perda de pacote. E aqui no Codex você pode ter o ExitLag com 20% de desconto. O que você vai ter que fazer? Aqui embaixo tem um link, você vai clicar no link e vai usar o cupom LORDMONS. Só isso, galera. E o ExitLag, ele funciona para computadores, consoles e até celulares. Pode usar nos seus MMOs asiáticos do celular ou nos seus FPS, no console e também no celular, tudo na mesma conta. E além disso, você não precisa acreditar em mim, porque você pode testar de graça e não precisa colocar o seu cartão de crédito. Basta clicar no link, criar sua conta, e eu sei que vocês vão gostar, e na hora que for comprar, coloca lá o cupom LORDMONS para vocês terem aquele desconto, tá bom? Então, muito obrigado para todo mundo que está usando e muito obrigado para todo mundo que vai usar. Clica no link e usa o cupom LORDMONS. Valeu, galera!
World of Warcraft has seen 10 expansions released, with 2 more already announced. But what if things had gone differently? We know of at least one unreleased expansion and many lost concepts. The expansions we know could have had completely different themes.
Ele tá falando aqui, não tá aparecendo na legenda, não sei porquê, mas tudo bem. Basicamente ele tá falando de que World of Warcraft já teve 10 expansões lançadas e pelo menos uma expansão que foi cancelada que a gente sabe oficialmente.
Storylines, main characters, or
O que o Lorde fica fazendo para encontrar um vídeo russo sobre World of Warcraft? Cara, na verdade, eu não descobri esse canal russo. Eu descobri um canal americano que fez o react desse vídeo, aí eu fui pro vídeo original, né? Mas eu fico procurando canais de jogos por coisa até do meu próprio trabalho. Mas na verdade eu não descobri esse canal russo, eu descobri um canal americano que fez o react desse vídeo. E na verdade, o YouTube ele tá meio maluco, não sei se é só pra mim, eu já vi outras pessoas falando sobre isso. Ele tá recomendando os canais que não tem nada a ver. Às vezes, é até sobre um assunto que você procurou, mas é um canal com 20 views, sabe? Ou às vezes ele começa a recomendar uns assuntos que você nunca procurou, que você nunca quis saber, mas ele começa a recomendar.
might never have even existed. It's quite interesting to look back at all of this in retrospect. Today, I want to talk about unreleased expansions. a pseudo-leak of a new expansion that stirred up the community and other fascinating unrealized concepts that could have dramatically altered the direction of.
Desculpa, galera.
Reportedly heard about the unreleased Southern Seas expansion more than once, so I don't see much point in dwelling on it too long. One of the primary sources of information about this rumored expansion.
Tá, só pra voltar aqui do que a gente estava falando. Ele está começando falando sobre uma expansão dos Mares do Sul, que na verdade é uma expansão que já foi confirmada que a Blizzard estava trabalhando, mas ela cancelou, tá?
Comes from Jonathan Startz, a former Blizzard developer who, during his tenure, contributed to a vast number of locations and dungeons. In various interviews, he mentioned that instead of the Burning Crusade, they considered a naval-themed expansion. The action would have unfolded in the Southern Seas, focusing on a pirate theme. However, due to technical issues and limitations, they decided to prioritize Outland, which was on a separate map, creating less strain on the game engine. Essentially, that's almost all we know, just small fragments of information. If we delve into speculation, it's
Cara, é muito bizarro da gente pensar que a primeira expansão que a Blizzard pensou foi dos Mares do Sul e até hoje ela não fez essa expansão. Foi a primeira coisa que ela pensou e até hoje ela não fez.
Plausible that the Bloodsail Buccaneers would have played a significant role in the expansion. Booty Bay could have once again become a major player hub. We also might have seen numerous small islands, each with its own unique history. This is where the Warcraft RPG books become noteworthy. While not entirely canon, they contained interesting concepts. For example, there were more detailed mentions of Kazan, the Goblin Island that developers originally planned to introduce in vanilla, but postponed for many years.
Esse mapa aqui que ele está mostrando, eu não lembro se é do Warcraft 1 ou do Warcraft 2, tá? Por que essa expansão faz todo sentido? Porque desde o Warcraft 1, principalmente o Warcraft 2, que teve uma expansão exatamente só sobre essa questão naval, né? A gente conhece bastante dessas ilhas. Elas estão no World of Warcraft desde o Warcraft 1 mais do Warcraft 2, né? E tem muita coisa ali para ser explorada. Seria uma expansão filler? Sim, mas por outro lado seria uma expansão um pouco mais leve, de toda a expansão ter o mundo está sendo destruído, alguma ameaça cósmica que quer destruir o mundo, tá?
RPG books describe Plunder Isle as an oddly shaped place that served as a convenient, protected hub for pirates. The Southern Seas also housed the Darkspear Islands, home to the tribe itself. So, theoretically, there was a foundation for content.
Sim.
The question remains whether it would have been enough for an entire expansion, and if it would have been more interesting than the story of the Orcs' tragically destroyed homeworld, but that's no longer relevant. Discussions about a naval expansion resurfaced during Dragonflight, but for a different reason. The game began incorporating more and more elements that hinted at pirate themes, seafaring, and distant voyages. Notes appeared about heroes crossing seas, and new cosmetic items with a nautical flair were added. So, once again, people began to theorize that a naval expansion might be on the horizon. And this doesn't even consider the numerous fan-made concepts of varying detail that envisioned how such an expansion could look. Unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll see anything similar in the near future.
Se fosse essa expansão Mares do Sul, assim, eu acharia interessante, porque como eu falei, apesar de ser um tema meio que batido, pirata, é um tema que sempre teve no World of Warcraft, já apareceu bastante no World of Warcraft, é um tema, mesmo sendo batido, ele nunca foi devidamente explorado dentro do jogo. A gente tem piratas aqui, a gente tem goblins ali, mas nunca foi muito explorado no jogo. Seria algo bem diferente do que a gente já tem. Mas eu acho muito difícil, talvez, você ter uma expansão só disso. Eu veria muito mais como um parte, talvez, de uma expansão, um patch de uma expansão, do que especificamente uma expansão em si. Até porque, o que aconteceu? Algumas dessas ilhas que estariam no Mares do Sul já apareceram, como Kazan, as Ilhas Partidas já apareceram, né? Várias dessas pequenas ilhas a gente já viu em algum momento. Outras não.
Instead of the Southern Seas expansion, we got the Burning Crusade, a conceptually fantastic expansion in my opinion. While we know a lot about Vanilla's development, information on Outland's creation is comparatively scarce. However, there are mentions of fascinating concepts that, if implemented, would have drastically changed the tone of the Burning Crusade. Let's start with the basics, how the expansion would have begun. we, the heroes
Agora ele tá falando sobre como é que era o conceito original de Burning Crusade, que seria diferente do que a gente teve quando
of
lançou.
Azeroth, having defeated an old god, slain Kel'Thuzad, and decapitated the Black Dragons, suddenly learn that the Dark Portal, sealed for many years, has reopened. High Lord Cruel would be rampaging across Azeroth, and skirmishes with Burning Legion forces would begin. Heroes would gather to stop this madness, preparing an expedition through the Dark Portal to resolve the problem once and for all. Originally, the premise was different. Instead of the Dark Portal suddenly opening and unleashing demons, the protagonists themselves would decide to open it. To do so, players would have to complete a questline for the Book of Medivh, an ancient and powerful artifact tied to the legacy of the Last Guardian, first introduced in the Warcraft RTS games as the key to unimaginable forces. Afterward, players would gather the necessary materials and perform a ritual to open the Dark Portal. I suppose that many people would have to be involved in order to gather these resources. I think this would have been a lighter version of the Ankiraj gate opening questline.
Bem interessante. Então, em vez de só o portal abrir, os jogadores teriam que participar de um evento para a abertura do portal, mais ou menos como foi a abertura dos portais de Ankiraj. Bem legal essa ideia da Blizzard.
However, the idea of portals to other worlds wasn't supposed to be limited to just the Dark Portal and Outland. The Burning Legion used Outland as a convenient base of operations, a launching point for their endless campaign to attack and conquer other worlds, enslaving their inhabitants or stripping them of their resources. Illidan, realizing the scale of their threat, stood against the Burning Legion, and after seizing control of Outland, he began methodically closing the portals the demons used to travel between realms. But this didn't mean the Burning Legion would stop there, not at all. One particularly interesting remark from the developers while discussing the expansion was, in reality, the portals were closed by Illidan. However, some quests in the Burning Crusade expansion imply their reopening and travel to new dimensions, fighting the Legion in new worlds.
Interessante.
Unfortunately, we weren't really given the opportunity to extensively travel to other worlds conquered by the Legion.
Mas, basicamente, é aquele sistema que a gente teve em Legion. Que é até aqueles portais que a gente entra e enfrenta a Legião naquele outro mundo.
Perhaps the developers ran out of time to fully implement this idea, or maybe the concept only sounded good on paper. In any case, the concept was abandoned, but it would have been incredibly interesting to see other worlds ravaged by the Burning Legion in the Burning Crusade. The initial plans for Cataclysm also held a number of intriguing differences compared to the expansion's released version. Cataclysm aimed to revamp much of the old world while adding new features. Initially, Deathwing wasn't meant to emerge from the Maelstrom, but from a different location, a forgotten zone in the Eastern Kingdoms. Since the days of Vanilla, an area north of Stormwind had remained unused in the game. It lacked quests, NPCs, and environmental details, essentially functioning as a vast wasteland. Developers intended to utilize this very spot, making it Deathwing's emergence point, a massive scar, a scorched line cutting through several Eastern Kingdom zones and reaching the continent's eastern shore, would have visibly extended from this location. We also could have seen Deathwing's traces in Grim Batol. However, this idea was scrapped, and the location was simply submerged, seemingly never to hold anything interesting again. Incidentally, Grim Batol itself, as players speculated at various times, could have had a far more extensive storyline. To begin with, Grim Batol is a highly significant place in the history of the Horde and the First Wars. It was where the Orcs held Alexstrasza captive and utilized her dragons to wage war against the Alliance. Several important battles of the First Wars also took place there. There are hints that this location was intended to be a full-fledged raid, not just a 5-person dungeon. For example, the name of the map and some items included the raid tag, and the inherent importance of the place hinted at a much larger role. But let's shift to Kalimdor,
Então Grim Batol seria uma raid.
where another zone was meant to receive more plot development. I'm referring to Silithus. This zone played a crucial role in Vanilla, as protagonists prepared for battle against the Chiraji and the old god Sithun there. The famous Ankiraj Gate opening questline took place in this location. Its importance in Vanilla was immense. However, after Vanilla's events, the zone received almost no updates. Even in Cataclysm, changes were minimal, especially compared to other Kalimdor zones that were radically transformed. Within the game files, there was a questline hinting at a renewed confrontation with the forces of the old gods. Initially, these quests would have players suspecting that the Chiraji were still active, despite being believed defeated. Furthermore, it seemed something sinister was brewing in the zone for Azeroth's heroes. Further into the quests, we would have learned that Twilight's Hammer cultists had recently been lingering around one of the hives, though their purpose wasn't entirely clear. Players, disguised as a Chiraji egg, were meant to secretly infiltrate the hive's lair, only to discover that cultists had established it as a hidden, inconspicuous base. There were also several other quests, though unlike the previous ones, they lacked textual descriptions. However, we could see what happened after accepting them. We would be transported into a dark vision of an old god. Above Cenarian Hold, an eye, the eye of the old god Sethun, would rise. Horrific tentacles would surround the city, and the stronghold itself would be engulfed in flames. Furthermore, demonic tentacles would sprout from the night elves tasked with defending the location. We would have needed to save the situation and help the elves fend off the old god's forces. But what this vision truly signified and what storyline it intended to convey remains unclear. It's unlikely it signaled the full return of the old gods in Cataclysm. More likely, I'd assume, it was a new surge of activity from Twilight's Hammer cultists and other maddened factions.
Tá, então a gente teria mais quests do Kitum e dos Old Gods lá em Sirius no Cataclisma. Faz sentido.
In the interim period between Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor, an interesting controversy arose around a purported pseudo-expansion titled The Dark Below. Let's clarify. Over the years, World of Warcraft has seen countless expansion leaks, some impressively convincing, others clearly low effort and quickly forgotten. The story with The Dark Below is a little different. It all began with news that Blizzard had registered the trademark The Dark Below in the United States. The very next day, the same trademark was registered in Europe. What made this even more intriguing was that it happened shortly before Gamescom, where Blizzard intended to make a significant announcement. Blizzard hinted at a major announcement that would draw the attention of the heavens, the burning hells, and everything in between. This sparked considerable excitement within the Warcraft community. There had been past instances where Blizzard registered trademarks shortly before announcing new expansions. For example, news about the Mists of Pandaria trademark draw the attention of the hells and every considerable excitement within the Warcraft
Cara, tem vários canais aqui que nem falam mais do WoW. Danger Dolan.
community. There had been past
Cara, eu via muito esse canal aqui, Danger Dolan, do World of Warcraft. Eu adorava ver esse canal aqui. Nem sei se existe mais.
instances where Blizzard registered trademarks shortly before announcing new expansions. For example, news about the Mists of Pandaria trademark registration appeared in gaming media months before the official announcement. Some joked about the Dark Below, while others speculated and hoped such an expansion could actually materialize. Beyond assumptions about a potential Warcraft expansion, there was a theory that the Dark Below was an expansion for Diablo 3. As it turned out, that Gamescom exhibition was indeed expected to be Diablo-related. But if it had been a Warcraft expansion, what could it have been about? Players latched onto the Warcraft RPG books, which contained mentions of the Dark Below. In old texts, it was described that the source of energy for sorcerers emanated from a horrifying place filled with demons and infernal creatures. In other words, it was a kind of hell in old Warcraft lore. In any case, something interesting seemed to be brewing, perhaps the return of the Burning Legion or new demon strongholds in Azeroth. However, fan hopes were quickly dashed. It turned out that anyone could file a trademark application, and it didn't even require a fee. Anyone could have submitted anything in Blizzard's name, so this entire story was likely a prank by trolls. Draenor. So much has already been said about this expansion. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, Draenor ended up being far less expansive than originally intended by the developers. A significant portion of the planned content was either cut, reworked, or removed altogether. Most players have heard about the loss of Farallon, a vast island and magical hub of Draenor, once covered in dense forests and towering crystals. The same applies to the Ogre South Continent, which was meant to expand the lore of the Ogres, longtime enemies of the Orcs. On this continent, we had to face the Empire of Ogres, instead of their relatively limited appearance in Draenor. We even have an in-game note from an Orc who claims to have seen those southern lands with his own eyes. Even the expansion's opening premise was supposed to be different from what we ultimately saw at release. Many early concepts were scrapped or replaced, which is of course completely normal in the development process. Just take a look at Legion's early concepts, where Kultira
Conceito original de Legion. Uou! Tá.
was placed right next to the Broken Isles, or some of the initial artwork for the Maw. It's often surprising how different things could have been, so there's nothing inherently wrong with early ideas being replaced. One of the earliest concepts imagined massive hourglasses connecting alternate Draenor and Azeroth instead of the Dark Portal. These would have been located not in the distant part of Tanaan jungle, but in central Draenor, at the crossroads of several zones. How this device would work is not entirely clear, but to be honest, the final idea with the Dark Portal was indeed better. Another very early idea didn't even involve alternate Draenor at all. Instead, after his defeat in Pandaria and subsequent escape from prison, Garrosh would flee to Outland, the broken, twisted remnant of the original Orcish homeworld. There, he would seek out the lingering traces of ancient Orcish power and use one artifact to resurrect the legendary clan chieftains of old. In this version of the story, Garrosh was meant to grow even more dangerous and fanatical, ultimately serving as the final boss of the expansion, rather than meeting his end in a personal duel with Thrall in the fields of Nagrand. There was also a planned storyline involving a group called the Okril Lon, Horde warriors who had long defended the Horde fortress in the Blasted Lands. NPCs associated with the Okril Lon are present in the game files as part of the Iron Horde, implying that some orcs may have betrayed the modern Horde and joined Garrosh's cause.
Cara, eu acho que seria mais interessante se a história de Warlords of Draenor fosse assim, né? Em vez de ser a Draenor alternativa de outra linha do tempo no passado, se o Garrosh tivesse ressuscitado os líderes orcs. Faria muito mais sentido e não quebraria tanto a lore.
Doomhammer, a legendary orc and leader of one of the greatest clans, was supposed to have a much more prominent role in the story. A fierce warrior and pragmatist, Orgrim was known for both his strength and his deep loyalty to his people. In our timeline, Orgrim and the Frostwolf clan had a fairly positive relationship, which continued even years after the invasion through the Dark Portal. Orgrim and Durotan were friends, and both were skeptical of the direction Gul'dan was leading the Horde. Orgrim's hammer was eventually passed down to Thrall after the Second War, symbolizing the hope for a more honorable Horde. In alternate Draenor, this friendship was reflected as well, though here, Durotan and Orgrim found themselves on opposite sides. Durotan opposed the Iron Horde, while Orgrim remained loyal to it. For a time, he eventually had a redemption arc, realizing the Iron Horde was a dangerous force leading their people toward ruin. In the release version, Orgrim dies in a battle with Blackhand, one of the key Iron Horde leaders. He only appears a handful of times in-game, even though there were plans to explore his character more deeply. There are hints that his storyline was supposed to unfold further in Gorgrond, but it was likely cut back due to significant reworks. The location was redesigned, and some parts of the storyline involving orcs were cut. There was even a planned questline involving the Worgen, focusing on their struggle to control their inner savagery. The daughter
Eu não sabia disso. Teria uma quest dos Worgens.
of King Greymane traveled to Draenor, seeking a cure for the curse. One removed quest suggests the king himself was growing more feral, and this madness was spreading among the people of Gilneas. A chemist named Krenan Aranas eventually discovered something that might have helped them. All in all, there was a vast amount of story content in Draenor that was either reworked or entirely scrapped. How many of these unused ideas still lie hidden deep in Blizzard's internal files is anyone's guess. But one thing is clear, had these concepts made it into the final product, Warlords of Draenor would have been a very different expansion.
Sim. Isso a gente já sabia, né? Que o Warlords of Draenor, além de ter sido cortada pela metade, eles também cortaram várias ideias, né? Eu já até contei pra vocês que eu tava na BlizzCon que a Blizzard anunciou o Warlords of Draenor, as quests iniciais eram totalmente diferentes. A quest inicial da Aliança era defender Karabor, que é o Templo Negro. Karabor era a cidade, que depois virou o Templo Negro. Era defender Karabor de um ataque da Horda de Ferro, dando a entender de que aquilo viraria a capital da Aliança, né? Isso aí que foi totalmente cortado, né? Cara, o vídeo é bem legal, gostei do vídeo, apesar dos problemas aqui do YouTube, bugando as legendas, né? Não foi exatamente sobre expansões canceladas, teve uma expansão cancelada nisso e depois ideias das expansões que foram cortadas. Mas é bem interessante, achei bem legal. Gostei desse vídeo. Vou botar o link aqui embaixo, a não ser que eu esqueça, e aí vocês brigam comigo para eu botar o link depois aqui.